Hello and welcome to Mentors Coaching FM, the show that helps you tame the business beast and build a marketing machine so that you can focus on helping your clients get the transformation you promise. I'm Gail Seymour, founder of Mentors Coaching, the results-oriented growth platform where learning providers of all stripes can create and deliver courses and programs that handle scheduling, payments and delivery all in one place with no monthly fee. Just a simple, low commission structure that means if you don't earn, you don't pay. Hello, my lovelies. I have an absolute treat for you today. We have a very special guest with us who's going to be telling us things that we really want to know. He's going to be answering all of our deepest, darkest questions today. So I have with me Jason Cercone, who is a brand evolution expert and who helps coaches and consultants, people just like all of us, go from unknown to undeniable. And so I'm sure you will all have lots and lots of follow-up questions after this one. I'm going to do my best to plumb the depths first. So before I subject you to that barrage of questions, Jason, would you like to just first give us a little bit of an introduction to you, who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are?
I would love to, Gail, and I'm hoping that I can meet the expectations that you've set. The bar has been raised incredibly high, but I'm going to do my best to bring all the value today. So I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. It's a great chance for me to connect with you and speak to your wonderful audience. I've been in the podcasting game since 2015, and that's really what's brought me to where I am today. A lot has happened in that time frame. And just to give you the short story, started podcasting. Me and my best friend did a show. We took it as far as we could and really learned a lot in the process. And once we shut that show down, I started another show, realized that, you know what, I'm really digging podcasting because I see it as this just ultimate stage and platform for connection and networking and meeting new people and amplifying a message on a global scale. But I want to get better at this. So I think it's time for me to unplug the microphone for a little while and just go back to school. So I didn't put a specific timeline on how long that would be, but it ended up being about a year and a half where I just listened to podcasts. I watched television personalities on the news and listened to radio personalities and how they conducted interviews, because I really wanted to get a feel for what they were doing to communicate with their audiences. And I wanted to bring that skill set to podcasting. And it paid off because once I came back and turned the mic back on, I felt much more comfortable. I had more of an engagement or more of an engaging story and storytelling ability to my skill set. And it's just morphed into many different things. I helped a friend of mine get a podcast off the ground in 2019. And that was a light bulb moment for me because I realized there are probably a lot of people out there that want to leverage the podcasting platform but aren't quite sure how, or just don't have the time to truly commit to what it takes to build a successful podcast. So that's what got things running for me. And then in that time frame, I switched once again and put my focus on the guesting side, because in my opinion, I feel that anybody that's looking to take their brand from unknown to undeniable, to get exposure, to build a lucrative network and create solid relationships, and at the same time communicate with a global audience of targeted listeners, podcasting's where it's at. But Gail, you can attest, more than likely you had some guests that come on that just aren't prepared. They may feel like they're doing the right thing, but they're truly not invested in a strategy that can help them maximize their ROI as a podcast guest. So that is what led me to develop my authority enhancer system. And I work with coaches and consultants to help them build thought leadership in their niche as value-driven podcast guests. And there's a lot in that we can talk about, and I'm sure we're going to dig into it today. So in a nutshell, that's what I've been doing in the podcast space. And I'm a big football fan. I love golfing, and I love a good glass of bourbon and a cigar to give you some insight into my personal life as well.
Excellent.
It's not all business over here.
Can't all be business, can it? Can't all be business.
That's right.
Oh, where to begin? Where to begin? So many questions. I'm going to be as unselfish about this as I can, and I'm going to start from the perspective of a lot of my clients who don't necessarily want to run their own podcast, but want to get out there and will want to be a podcast guest and to speak. And so let's focus on those first, and then if we have time, I'm going to pump you for information from the podcasting side.
Certainly.
Just because, still getting started. And so first of all, convince them that they need to be out there on the podcasts. What would you say to somebody who says that they want to, whether they're going to be an author, they're publishing a book, or they're coaching and they're starting a platform, or whatever it is that they're doing, but they're media shy? How do you get people over that hump first?
Well, the first step is really determining the objectives that they have in place. And what are the goals? What are the expectations? What do you really want to achieve? And when you start to break it down into establishing pillars in which you can build your content around, you can start to create different avenues in which to build. So you have your media, you have your social media, you have your podcast interviews, you have all of these different elements that will help you grow. But when you look at all of them through a wide lens, what you'll realize is that you are telling a good story, and that story is yours. And the best stories are the ones that are authentic and the ones that come from within. So it starts with getting comfortable with that. And when you get comfortable with that, it's much easier to make these podcast guest appearances because you're not trying to fake it. And that's what happens a lot of times is people try to put this false image of themselves into the world, whether it be through the social media, whether it be through videos, podcasts, you name it. And when it comes time to connect with somebody, they get exposed almost immediately because they're not that person they put out into the world. So when you connect with me, what you hear on a podcast is what you're going to get in a in a one-on-one consultation, in any type of training or learning environment that you find yourself in with me. I put myself out there. I'm very outgoing. I'm very much an extrovert, and my personality is going to shine through the same in each and every interaction that we have. So that's step one, is you have to get comfortable with being yourself. And it's actually easier than it seems, because the big block that you have to get past is that no one wants to hear your story. And that's BS. We know that because you wrote a book, right? You put something into the world, and you did that because you wanted to communicate that you have information and expertise to share. So how can we take that mindset and apply it to podcasting? Just take that voice and translate it and be yourself, be authentic, be you. And the right people are going to be attracted to you because of that. And as almost a bonus, you will repel the wrong people because you don't necessarily want to be in business with the wrong people. That can be a tremendous weight on your shoulders that you have to bear every day. But when you attract the right people, that's going to make everything come together, and you're going to have a lot more fun building your brand and telling your story to the world.
Excellent. I don't know if you noticed, I had a little bit of a chuckle right at the very beginning of your answer, because my clients will think we've been collaborating beforehand on the answers, because that it is exactly what you even used some of the same words and phrases. It's like because whenever somebody comes to me with a problem, they all know that the first question they're going to get back is, what are you trying to achieve? And so, because, everything else depends on that. So, but Absolutely. To actually hear somebody else saying it back,
you can get lost if you don't have that roadmap that you build from the very start. It's very tough to jump off a cliff and then build the hang glider on the way down.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have what I call my power plan, which is the P is positioning. And so I know that you're quite big on positioning as well. So maybe you'd like to give us your take on that.
Absolutely. And for me, when I'm, and this isn't just me, I feel this is all of us as humans. We all encounter problems on a daily basis, some small, some big. And when we encounter those problems, we are ultimately going to look for a solution. And when we look for that solution, we're going to look for the best solution. And in doing that, let's say we consult Google and we type in our question, looking for our answer. We're going to get bombarded with so much. So as we sift through this content, typically on page 1, most people don't get past that. I'm a geek. I like to go to page 2 just to see what's there. But typically I rely on page 1. But the point I'm driving at is, as you're sifting through this information, who are you going to put your trust in? Are you going to put your trust in somebody that looks a little shady? Maybe their advice just seems a little off and you just, it just isn't resonating. And I don't know about this person. Or are you going to turn to the person that has a line of people thanking them for helping them solve the same problem you have? Every one of us is going to go with the latter. That person is known as a thought leader. They are there to willingly give their expertise to help people solve problems. They're there to serve. They're there to help people get to the next level and ultimately feel a transformation. That's what we seek. We often get bombarded with sales tactics and sales pitches and items and articles and things just being thrown at us day after day. But if it doesn't deliver the transformation that we seek, or if we don't feel that it will deliver that transformation, we typically move on. So positioning yourself as a thought leader is going to make people look at your brand differently. When they look at your brand differently, that's what's going to put you on the map, because you won't be seen as this perhaps sketchy little resource. You're actually a person that people want to get into business with. They want to turn to. They see you as the resource. You help them solve a problem. They may have 10 friends experiencing the same problem, and they're going to say, you need to listen to Gail's podcast. You need to read Gail's book. You need to see what she's doing because she has the solution for you. It helped me. It changed my life. When you put yourself in that position, you're going to be set up for tremendous success, but it takes time to do that. And that's why I am so strongly behind podcast guesting, because each and every guest opportunity you make, not only do you create this huge piece of content that could be shared across the world that serves you and your brand for as long as it lives on the internet, you're also creating relationships with the people you collaborate with. Gail, before we turned on the microphones today, you and I were talking about some potential ways that maybe we could work together. You create these types of opportunities when you find the right podcasts to make guest appearances on, then you position yourself as a valuable asset, and you respect what the other person is trying to accomplish. Now, if I showed up and just went into sales mode and told everybody why they need to buy my program and become part of my world, more than likely you would turn this off and then delete it. Who wants to hear a sales pitch, right?
Exactly.
And that's why I show up with value. I'm here to communicate. I'm here to tell your audience all of these great opportunities that are available if you do it right. And in doing that, hopefully I'm going to share some insights on how you can get started. And if you want to take things a little further, I'm always available. But my goal is to bring value to the podcast, and that positions me as a thought leader in my space. So the more you can do that, the more gains you're going to experience as you grow your brand.
Absolutely. It's just, we really could just be singing off the same song sheet. So now that's the whole, the why to do it and why it matters and all the rest of it. But now let's focus on the how a little bit. How do you suggest somebody who's somebody's a total newbie, never been on a podcast, doesn't have any idea? I mean, obviously they've some grounding in, they've got a few of their stories sorted out. They're already doing some coaching. They're not completely new to the business and they're doing a little bit of marketing on social media maybe, but never been on a podcast.
Okay.
what would you advise as somebody's early steps?
I would not try to fly blind. I would absolutely reach out to somebody like myself, even just to have a conversation. And I know with me, I offer a discovery session where we can connect and we can talk about your goals and expectations. And typically, when we're in that conversation, I'm going to learn a little bit about what you want to accomplish, what your experience level is, and I can at least give you some guidance to get started. If you're committed to doing this yourself, then at least you have some semblance of an idea on how to proceed, because there can be a lot of mistakes that you'll experience, and sometimes that's not the worst thing in the world. But if you can go into those early interviews with a little bit of guidance that helps flatten the learning curve to some degree, that's going to help. So I'll give a little bit of insight now as to what you can do to get started. It starts with determining why, of course, as we talked about earlier. You have to understand what you want to achieve as a podcast guest. What is your main objective? What are your brand objectives? How do you want this to grow your business? Do you want podcast guesting to 10x your revenue? Do you want to generate more clients that are coming into your business on a lower level? Again, it's all subjective to your goals. So once you have that plan in place, you start looking at podcasts that your ideal customers would be listening to. So let's just say you're in the finance space, for example. There are a lot of great financial-based podcasts out there, and those are good, and you can look at those as opportunities, but you don't want to disqualify perhaps some self-improvement podcasts or some marketing podcasts and some other shows that would not only value your expertise for the content side of their creations, but the audience that you'd be speaking to would also resonate with your message to the point that they take the next step and they follow your call to action. So once your plan's in place, determining the right podcast to be a part of is one of the biggest pieces to this puzzle. Because if you start going on podcasts that have no relevance to what you're doing, nothing's going to happen. You're going to get some practice, but you're not going to get the right practice because the questions you're getting served are just not going to serve you. Because it's just, again, I think the analogy I always use is if you're in finance and you go on a fantasy football podcast, no one's listening to that podcast for financial advice. They're listening to that for fantasy football advice so they can take their money from their friends or take money from their friends. So you have to be in a space to where your message is resonating with the audience. And at the same time, it's giving you an opportunity to network with like-minded professionals. So if you're not in that mindset, it's going to be very hard to gain traction. And I'll skip ahead, and I know we're going to get into this more. Once you get to the right shows and you do the actual interview, you use that as a strong networking tool. When that content goes live, I cannot stress this enough, use it, share it. So many people go on podcasts and make guest appearances, and they may do a great job, but then they completely ghost the host. And you never hear from them again, and they never do a thing with that content. And I will never understand that mentality. You took the time to lend your expertise. They did all the heavy lifting by putting this content together for you. Now use it in your own practices. Share it on your website, put it in your email newsletters, share it on social media. If they tag you, reshare it. This is content that positions you as a thought leader. It showcases your expertise, and it continues to solidify that belief in your client's mind that they are invested in the right resource. If you're not working on that level and you're not utilizing that content, it's a waste of your time. The podcasters are going to get something from it, no doubt, and you may get some business from it because that's part of the objective, but you're not maximizing what you can do with that piece of content if you just ignore it and let the podcast producers do all the work. So once you get to that endpoint, use that content to your advantage. And if you have it on your website, it's a great place to send people. If you're talking to somebody that has an issue that you haven't answered, I just talked about that on Gail's podcast. Jump over to my website. You can listen to my interview with her there. So it's constantly working for you. And at the same time, constantly working for you as the producer, because you're always driving traffic to that podcast. There's a lot to cover here. And this is why the system that I put together, it's a little bit more involved. And it's for good reason, because I want everyone to understand there is a strategy in place. And when you follow it like this, that's where the results come into play.
Excellent. I think you just that's the crux of it, is the strategy. Because it's easy to go and, just wander off onto a podcast or three and sit there and answer the questions that come back to you without actually thinking, this is what I'm here for. And just then, plug in whatever you're promoting at the end. Rather than if you've got that strategy, you can really address all of your answers to a logical endpoint, and it doesn't feel like it comes out of left field. Because it sometimes happens where you have a conversation with somebody, and when you get to the how can people continue the conversation with you, then the resource that they actually want to promote is just a complete disconnect. And so I think that strategy really does make a big difference. Now, absolutely. As somebody who is absolutely polished and relaxed and experienced on both sides of the fence. I mean, you as you say, you've run multiple podcasts and you're very comfortable as a podcast guest. What makes a good podcast guest?
I believe the number one element of a good podcast guest is having everything they do rooted in value. When you root your entire plan of action in value, you're going to win in some way, shape, or form, because you're going to have a plan of action. You're going to find the right podcasts for you. In turn, you're going to be the right guest for that podcast. So when that happens, more than likely, when you connect, you're going to feel some instant synergy and instant chemistry, because you're both out for the same thing, but you're going at it through two different avenues. But collaboratively, you can achieve great things. And this, when that happens, that's when the magic happens, because so many people come into this with this transactional mindset, just showing up, doing a little selling, doing some fancy talking, and they're out, completely leaving the opportunity to network and build a relationship on the table. Sometimes podcast hosts think the same way. I'm going to bring this person on. We're just going to have a few minutes of chit chat, and then I'll ask them some questions. We'll record it. I'll have a podcast episode. Your intentions have to go deeper than that. And that type of surface level, almost old school approach to podcasting is not going to gain listeners. And if you want to grow, you have to make compelling, captivating content. So coming at it from both sides, as the host, you better be ready to ask some non-surface level questions that get a guest talking. When I provide questions to the podcasts that I'm going to be a part of, I don't even call them questions. I call them conversation starters, because I know when I get asked those questions, I'm going to start a conversation with it. That's the idea. If you're the guest and you're not bringing that type of information to the table and helping a podcaster create a show format that caters to your expertise and gives you the opportunity to shine under that spotlight, you won't see many results, because people will tune in. They're just not going to jive with that message. They can feel the disconnect. They could feel that maybe it's a little transactional. This person isn't rooted in value. They aren't bringing their A game to the show. They're not going to resonate with the podcast. Therefore, they may never listen to that show again. Worse, they may never listen to you again. So to be a good podcast guest, you have to have all of your intentions rooted in value and position yourself as a valuable asset to those podcasters before, during, and after the podcast interview takes place. Beforehand, make sure they have everything they need. They have imagery, they have questions, they know who you are, they have a way to access you for information. You keep those lines of communication open. During, don't just show up to sell. Show up with the mindset of providing value at every juncture, whether the mic's on or off, meaning you're networking, you're having great conversation with the hosts and producers beforehand. You're delivering value top to bottom as the mics go hot. When things close down, you're still continuing that value. You're offering ways that they can refer people to you. You're maximizing your opportunity. And then after the fact, don't ignore that person. Don't ignore those podcasters. Don't sit on the sidelines for 3 months waiting for an interview to go live. Keep those lines of communication open. And this goes both ways. If you're building a relationship, not a lot of relationships are strong if there's only connection once every few months. Connection needs to happen. I'm not saying every day. You don't drop everything you're doing and start dating the person, but you maybe, Gail, you and I have a conversation today, and we're talking about this podcast guesting stuff. And then later on today, I'm on the internet and I come across an article that directly relates to what we're talking about. I will send it. And Gail, check this out. I was reading this and I thought of you because it reminded me of our conversation. That's powerful. That's what you do when you actually are invested in a relationship. So you're taking things to a new level. You have to be in that mindset in order to make this work, because a lot of times what will happen, like I can speak from the podcaster's perspective. Podcasters get frustrated when the guests don't share the content. And when I get told this, I say, what did you do to keep the relationship going after the interview ended? Was there any connection? No. Well, of course not. They've probably done 50 other interviews in that time frame, or they've done a number of other things, and it's just not the priority it was on the day you recorded. But if you're actually taking time to establish a relationship, and this can just be through social media, commenting on each other's posts, sharing their content, getting it in front of your audience, because if they were valuable enough to talk to your podcast audience, they're going to be valuable enough to talk to your social media audience. It's a progression. It's a relationship. It's value from beginning to end and beyond, because if you do this right, it really doesn't end. It just continues to build on itself.
Awesome. So yeah, I think you may have already answered the kind of the next thing that was bubbling in my head, is because we've already talked about how to get into the mindset and how to get started and what makes a good guest. And so the next thing I was going to ask you is actually about what to do with the content once you've got it, once you've been onto these podcasts. And so it's very easy to go on a podcast and share it on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and to just, as something comes out, share it once. Mm-hmm. But as you say, that's really just scratching the surface, and it's not making the most of that content that, you've gone out of your way to record. And so what are maybe, if somebody's only got 15 minutes, what would you say is the best use of those 15 minutes in terms of promoting podcast content?
Well, if you've got 15 minutes, we'll keep it on the low end. So the most obvious one for me is to have a page on your website that's dedicated to your podcast guest appearances. If you're truly investing in this as a strategy, and it's not just some one-off that I have a friend that has a podcast or a colleague that wants me to come on and talk, like you're just doing it one time, that's one thing. But if you're truly investing in this as a brand building strategy, which you have to invest in it to make it work, having a page on your website is boilerplate. You want to have that little hummingbird feeder that you can send people to where they can gain knowledge from you from all of these interviews. So if you have them in place, what I love about Spotify is that you can actually embed a player for your episode on your website, and it will give you a nice uniform look. And it allows people to listen to the show on the website if they want to. That doesn't always happen, but if they do, now they're on your website for an extended period of time. It boosts your retention rate. That's a story for another day. But one of the biggest values in doing it and having it on your website, for one, it takes 30 seconds to add. You just copy the code, you embed it on your website, and it's there. And then you have it to point people towards. If you say, like I said before, I was on Gail's podcast, I was just talking about this. Go listen to my interview with Gail. You can check it out on my website. But when they land there, not only do they find the interview with Gail, they see this stack of interviews talking about the same subjects. And this person clearly is a thought leader in their space. Look at how in demand they are. All these podcasts want to feature them as a guest. It continues to solidify that belief in a person's mind that they've made the right choice. They've put their trust in a resource that can truly help them. You've got a lot of social proof out there with all of these interviews. So that is probably that's one of the biggest misses that I see people making, is they're not adding these podcasts to their website. If you have an email list, it's always beneficial to share this information with your list. It's just another step in solidifying that belief, because you may have some people on your email list that are on the fence about doing business with you or wanting to take the next step in building that relationship with you. And maybe that podcast interview talks about the thing they needed to hear. to make them take the leap. So share it with your email list. And then the social media side of it, it can be multifaceted because a lot of times, especially in this world we live in now, the majority of podcasts are recorded much like you and I are doing today, Gail, virtually. Pre-COVID, I know I was doing virtual podcasting, but it seemed more like people were striving to have those face-to-face interviews. COVID changed everything, made this more normalized, and we're seeing so much value from it because not only do you have this audio content, you get the video component as well. So oftentimes the podcasters themselves will create additional content that they can use clips from the show on social media to promote and to push that person forward, to push that podcast episode forward, telling their audience it's out there, go listen. But as a podcast guest, this is something I built into my program that I want to do for everyone I work with. And this is completely at the discretion of the podcaster themselves. If they're willing to share the raw video, we can clip that up and pull out some of the best quotes, some of the best nuggets of great information, make our own information, or I'm sorry, make our own assets and share that on social media. All of a sudden, you could have a week's worth of content from one podcast interview. I've only been asked a handful of times on my podcast by my guest, hey, do you mind if I have the raw video? I'd like to clip this up and share some of it. I mean, on my end, I'm like, absolutely, you can have it. The more exposure, the better. And it shows me that you're valuing this process. You're actually taking the time to want to chop this up and utilize it for your own edification. So those are a few things that if you have that might go beyond the 15 minutes, actually taking time to create that content. But if you do have somebody that shares the content on social media and they tag you, share it, put out a little video on your stories, thanking them, just do something that goes the extra mile, but ultimately put that content in front of your audience so they continue to see the value you provide. And they continue to see that more and more people want to talk to you because you're a valuable resource.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, one little thing that just springs to mind is that, the next thing I was going to ask you is actually switching over to the host side point of view. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But if you're the guest and if you're on a podcast where it's shared onto YouTube, on YouTube, you have the option to make the little clips as well. So, you can take a clip up to a minute long and share those. So even if you don't have that time to really get the raw footage and make those clips, if you don't have a video editing team or the ability to do stuff, it is still possible then to get some little snippets and share them that way. So that's just the thing that sort of jumped out.
100%. Absolutely.
Now, flipping the switch a little bit, I'm going to start asking you the questions from the hosting side, because obviously, as I'm just finding my feet in this whole hosting business, I'm going to want to pump the expert for information. But I'd still like to do that from the point of view of what can I as a host do to make the experience the best it can be for the guests. And so how can I as a host make sure that a guest coming on actually gets the most out of it? What as a guest would you look for in the host?
The communication piece is huge. I'm thinking what I do with my show, I'm making sure that I have all the information up front. There's a lot of things that you can handle in those beginning stages. This is, when I'm talking on the promotion side for guests, I am a champion of getting everything to that person on the first correspondence. As a podcaster or as a host, when I see that type of thing come to me, it makes me realize the person's invested in the process and they actually took some time to learn some things. So if I'm getting their one sheet, their imagery, links to where I can learn more about them, they really want to know what it takes to be on this show. And they're going the extra step because they know I'm going to ask for this information. They probably looked on social media and saw how I promote. Now they want to know, or now they want to get me that information because I'm going to ask for it anyway. So I look for things like that from the host side, is having that open line of communication to make sure that you can get everything up front. You're not chasing somebody down for an image when the show is ready to go live. You have all of these assets built up. when the show is getting ready to begin, and this is something in the preparation process, from the guest side, making sure you're providing ample information, because this is for you. I mean, you are going to help create great content, and it's going to be for a global audience. It's going to be for that host to utilize to build their portfolio and build their audience, but you're center stage and you want to have the best experience, and you want to help that host give you the best experience. So give them enough information to where they can gather enough to know how to put something together that caters to you, that makes that expertise shine. As the host, I would say the biggest shortcoming I see with a lot of hosts is they're asking very surface level questions. If you're asking surface level questions, it's going to probably lead to surface level answers, and it becomes very canned, almost sounds scripted. It's because that guest has been telling the same story on every podcast they go on that asks that question. You have a very limited window of time. Maybe it's an hour, maybe it's half an hour. You want to suck as much value out of that time with that person as possible. So ask them questions that really get them engaged in the process. Don't just ask them. You work with authors, Gail, so this is a perfect example. I tell this story often. If you ask an author, tell me about writing your book, that's a very plain question that's going to lead to, well, I sat down and just talked about this. It leads to a number of different surface level responses. But if you ask something like, I've talked to a lot of authors, and I know the creative process can be incredibly frustrating. Was there ever a point when you were writing your book that you just hated everything on the page and you wanted to hit delete and start over? That question more than likely is going to elicit a little bit of a chuckle. And it's going to make it's going to make that guest say, you know what? No one's ever asked me that before. Let me tell you a good story. That, without question, is my favorite thing to hear as a podcast host. When I have a guest say that to me, I know that I've tapped into something that they don't get to talk about very often, and they're going to be excited to tell a story that's new and fresh. So not only do they get that experience, for me, I know instantly there's my clippable content. I'm going to share this on social media to get people excited to listen to this episode. You have to think on this new level or higher level in regards to creating compelling content, because when it comes to anything that you consume, social media, podcasts, television, videos, movies, if you're not captivated, if you don't get emotionally invested, you're done. If the movie's terrible, you walk out. If the show's bad, you watch an episode and you bail. Podcasting works the same way. If I tune in as a listener, I have an expectation that I'm going to be entertained. I'm going to be educated. Maybe I'm just going to escape from my world for half an hour, and this podcast is going to be my conduit to that escape. If it doesn't pan out that way, why would I remain loyal to that podcast? Why would I tell all my friends you have to listen to this podcast? So as a host, if you want to grow, you have to think compelling, you have to think captivating, and you have to not ask surface level questions. You really have to dig deep. And that's, I still, to this day, as an exercise, when I put together the questions that I have for my guests before we sit down to record the interview, I look at every single question and I ask myself, is that captivating enough? Or can I spin this a little bit more and add a new layer that goes add a new element that goes a layer deeper? I'm all about getting the most compelling content and the most compelling answers out of my guests. That's the biggest tip I can give to any podcast host, because when you do that, then you've got the guest telling all their colleagues, holy shit, you got to go and talk to Gail. Like, this podcast, I had so much fun and she asked such good questions. That's where it's at. And that's what's going to lead to the growth that you need to succeed.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I really could keep you here for hours. But we're gonna have to start.
That.
We're gonna have to start to wind up shortly. So,
I smell a sequel. I smell part 2 coming at some point.
There's definitely a return visit on the cards. Absolutely. So the last 2 questions are always the same, and I know that might be a little bit boring, but it's kind of, I always ask the same last 2 questions. And so the first one is, if somebody wants to continue the conversation with you and wants to find out more, which I am sure we're going to want to find out more, because, you know, you're talking to about a subject that is close to our hearts. What's the best way to get in touch with you, and what's the best way to connect with you?
That's the best way to connect with me. Head to my website, jasoncercone.com. And I'll even go a step further, jasoncercone.com/work with me. And you'll learn a little bit more about the process that I have in place, but you'll also find a calendar to where you can set up a free discovery session with me. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, I would love to hear what your thoughts are. If you've experienced anything in the podcasting space before that you would like some clarity on, and we can determine how podcasting could help your brand grow, specifically podcast guesting. And that's typically where I would recommend to everybody to start. If you are in the mindset of starting a show, doing some guest appearances first will help you get your feet wet, help you build a little bit of a network. And at the same time, you get comfortable with your voice, you can start to really fall in love with podcasting like I did. And then it'll make much more sense to proceed with doing your own show with a little bit of experience under your belt. So jasoncercone.com/work with me. And I look forward to connecting with you ASAP.
Awesome. And the last question, again, perhaps not the most original, but strangely enough, the one that tends to give people most pause for thought. And it's really simple. Is there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to say?
I think that the biggest element that people don't pay enough attention to in this space is consistency. And that's for both sides of the microphone. From the hosting side, when you're creating a podcast, you have to be consistent with your audio quality, with the overall quality of your content within that show, and then your release schedule. Because as you build a loyal audience, they're only going to remain loyal if you remain loyal to them. So if you say you're bringing new content to them every Thursday, if you don't show up, if they're expecting that content, they will work it into their life. I'll look at when I go on my walk on Thursday, I know I'm going to have this podcast to listen to. If it's not there, guess what? They're going to find another podcast to listen to because you are not the only show in town. And when that happens, you run into this possibility of them saying, well, this show's been replaced. I've got a new show in my rotation. You never want to risk that. Now, I'm not saying you can't take time away from your show. That's, of course, and we all have a life outside of this. You just have to be setting those type of standards with your audience by saying, going to be taking a little bit of a break. Thank you for listening to this episode. We're going to be back in a month, in a couple months, whatever the layoff that you want to put into place is, as long as you're communicating it, that's the biggest thing. So many podcasts just say, see you next week, and you never hear from them again. That circus left town. So consistently communicating with your audience is huge. From the guest side, consistency is tremendously huge because you have to get better at this. Nobody turns on the microphone for the first time and is an all-star. You have to find your voice. You have to get confident telling your story. And like I said, I've built something that helps flatten the learning curve to some degree, but you still have to get some practice reps in. Now, I've been golfing since I was 7 years old. I'm in no way, shape, or form Tiger Woods, but I can hold my own to some degree. But I have to take practice swings every time I play, or else I'm going to miss the ball. I'm going to hit a bad shot. You only get better if you put in the practice. So being consistent, when you build this into your brand building strategies, trying to do at least one interview a week is going to help your cause tremendously. All things that we can talk about as we connect off this show, but consistency is the biggest part of podcasting. If you respect it, you're going to go far.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm really, really looking forward to getting you back again. I have to say, and without offending anybody else, of all the guests we've had so far, I think I'm most looking forward to getting you back again. So you're not
Gail.
getting out of that one. You said it in public that you'll come back, so you're not getting out of that one.
No intentions of that. I greatly enjoyed our time to get together today, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your audience. It's been a blast.
Awesome. Thank you very much.